by Professor Adiel Schremer, who is Associate Professor of Ancient Judaism in the Department of Jewish History at Bar Ilan University, just outside of Tel Aviv in Israel. He teaches primarily on the history of the Jewish people in Palestine during the Second Temple period and in the first centuries of the Common Era. He is the author of Male and Female, He Created Them, Jewish Marriage in Late Second Temple, Mishnah, and Talmud Periods. And he is currently working on a new book, which last I heard was nearing completion, on Jewish-Christian relations in late antiquity, and that is the subject of Professor Schremer's presentation this afternoon under the title of Estranged Others, Estranged Brothers, Rabbinic Judaism, and Early Christianity. So please join me in welcoming Professor Adiel Schremer.
Thank you very much, Dr. Cunningham. I must admit that I'm greatly honored to be here this afternoon, and I'm very, very happy to be here at the center and at Boston College. It is not my first time in America, but every new time that I come, I feel not exactly like at home, but certainly extremely happy, especially in New England. The title of my present talk is Estranged Brothers, and I think that it somehow captures what I would like to suggest this afternoon, namely that the early followers of Jesus were brothers who were estranged from Jewish community by Jewish authorities. And by suggesting this, I would like to somehow question the very common notion of parting of the ways, because that notion implies a somehow equal standing to both communities, and I think that with the historical evidence that we have, it is difficult to maintain that paradigm. However, I hope that the material we will encounter this afternoon will stand on itself and will be interesting enough. The role Christianity has occupied in the formation of ancient Judaism has always been an important question for students of classical rabbinic literature. Although much drudgery is required in order to find references, either direct or indirect, to Christians and Christianity in rabbinic works of the first centuries of the Common Era, Jewish and Christian scholars alike were always troubled by the question, how much Christianity in Talmudic literature? In the last 2 decades or so, however, the treatment of that question has undergone a dramatic shift. According to conventional wisdom, writes Alan Siegel, right at the beginning of his book, Rebecca's Children, the first century witnessed the beginning of only one religion, Christianity. Judaism is generally thought to have begun in the more distant past, at the time of Abraham, or Moses, or even Ezra. In contrast to this traditional view, a whole new outlook has emerged in the writings of various scholars in the last 20 years. As Siegel puts it, and I quote, "The time of Jesus marks the beginning of not one, but 2 great religions of the West, Judaism and Christianity," end quote. As a result, instead of looking at Judaism as a mother and at Christianity as its daughter, as the relations between the 2 great religions are traditionally looked at, scholars have come more and more to agree that, in fact, Judaism and Christianity may claim a twin birth. This new outlook, which stands now at the heart of the writings of many students of ancient Judaism and early Christianity, has had far-reaching implications. The abandonment of the older view has resulted in greater willingness on the part of these scholars, primarily Jews, to discuss the relationships between Rabbinic Judaism and early Christianity in a more nuanced and open manner than previous generations of Jewish scholars would allow themselves. In particular, the Jewish apologetic tendency perhaps need, to presuppose the priority, both chronologically and implicitly also theologically, of Jewish sources over against similar Christian materials, which rests on and justified by an unconscious employment of the mother-daughter model, is now giving way to other possibilities. Some scholars argue for the opposite altogether. That is, for the chronological priority, in many cases, of the Christian materials, which were then borrowed and internalized by the Jewish sources. The work of Israeli historian Israel Yuval are perhaps the most representative of this approach. In several provocative papers published in the 90s, Yuval has argued that it was not Christianity alone who was influenced by Judaism, as scholars usually tend to assume, but also Judaism was influenced by Christianity. Indeed, according to Yuval, the entire rabbinic project should be seen as a response to Christianity. The rabbis, according to this view, were responding to Christian ideas and shaped Judaism in such a manner as to reject these ideas. Others have suggested seeing early Christianity and Rabbinic Judaism as two parallel transmission lines of one and the same older Second Temple Jewish tradition. These scholars emphasize the folkloric quality of much of the materials in our disposal, both Jewish and Christian, and suggest that many of the common ideas found in these writings reflect a common heritage. Instead of explaining similarities as a result of borrowing for the sake of polemic, as Yuval does, one should think of Jewish and Christian sources as two lines of transmission that reflect, separately, the same ancient tradition of the masses from which they have both sprang. In spite of the profound differences between these two approaches, they have nevertheless much in common. First, the historiographical outlook on which they both rest, even if this is never given explicit articulation, is one and the same. That is, they share the notion that both Rabbinic Judaism and Christianity should be seen as having arisen more or less together historically. Second, the phenomenon they seek to explain and the question they pose to the sources under discussion are very similar. Namely, how to account for the coexistence of comparable material in both Rabbinic and Christian sources of approximately the same time, the first few centuries of the Christian era. The fact that the former approach, Yuval's, explains this situation by applying a model of mutual borrowing, while the latter sees this as a natural result of their common roots, and from the actual proximity between Jews and Christians in late antique Palestine, cannot obscure their basically similar interest. Neither should it conceal their implicitly shared view of Judaism and Christianity as two distinct religious entities. In Yuval's approach, this is given quite an explicit exposition. He speaks of, quote, two rival groups who lived alongside one another. Two rival groups. Right after the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE. The other approach, too, although emphasizing the actual close relationships between Jews and Christians, shares the same fundamental view. For speaking of Judaism and Christianity as two parallel lines of transmission for one and the same reservoir of Second Temple traditions implies seeing them, at least on a conceptual and nominal level, as two distinct entities. Conceptually speaking, both approaches presuppose and thus reaffirm the most fundamental taken for granted view of Judaism and Christianity as two distinct religious and social entities. That eventually things have developed in this direction, one cannot deny. It is agreed, however, by virtually all scholars that Christianity, at its infancy, was a Jewish phenomenon. As James Dunn once wrote, and I quote, "It is important to remind ourselves that the first Christians," at this stage, of course, the term itself is anachronistic, "were all Jews, all loyal Jews. They did not see themselves as a new religion, end quote. And if so, one is surely allowed to ask, how and when has Christianity become something of which we think as not Jewish? What were the socio-historical and other processes through which the Jesus movement has become Christianity? If Lawrence Schiffman is correct that, quote, even if we were to accept many of the polemical statements in our sources at face value and assume the violations of Jewish law in the early Christian community to be more extensive, the early Christian would still be considered Jews. And if we accept his assertion that one should not assume that, quote, the claims that Jesus was a miracle worker or magician would have in any way reflected on the Jewish status of his followers, and that even in the belief in the divinity or messiahship of Jesus would not, in the view of the early rabbis, have read the early Christians out of the Jewish community, if we accept all this, and I certainly accept all this, how are we to account for the emergence of Christianity as an other, non-Jewish socio-religious entity? Surprisingly, this question is usually not addressed. Either scholars subscribe, even if unconsciously, to an essentialist view of Judaism and Christianity as two distinct religions right from Christianity's very birth, that is, either from the time of Jesus or from Paul's ministry to the Gentiles, or anachronistically project a late state of affairs on an earlier stage. Daniel Lasker's and Sarah Strum's opening sentence to their co-study, The Polemic of Nestor the Priest, the earliest extant anti-Christian Jewish polemical work of the 9th century CE, may serve as a useful example. The Jewish-Christian debate is as old as Christianity, they write. Soon after Jesus' death, Christian missionaries became active among Jews and pagans, and Christian authors composed a number of polemical works aimed at convincing both groups of the truth of the new religion. In order to speak of Christian missionaries who became active among Jews and pagans, that is, non-Jews who became active among Jews, in relation to the period soon after Jesus' death, one needs to entirely ignore the Jewishness of Jesus' followers and to view Christianity as a distinct social religious entity already from the days of Jesus. The separate existence of Judaism and Christianity as two distinct religions is simply taken here for granted. Being a social other, however, is not an inherent character. One is not born a social other. One becomes a such. And becoming a social other is the result of social and discursive manipulations that introduce one into such a category. This, moreover, is not done of its own accord. There needs to be someone who has the interest and the capability to interpose some members of society under such a title. We need therefore to search after those who have had the interest of producing some Jews as others, and to uncover the mechanisms which made the Jesus movement to be what it eventually became to be, a different social religious entity that lives out of the confines of Judaism, that is, Christianity. It is precisely against this taken for granted that Daniel Boyarin's recent contributions to the subject should be seen. In his book, Dying for God, published back in 1998, Boyarin first accepts the main innovation of the new trend, that instead of using the much-used metaphor of mother and daughter to describe the relations between Christianity and Judaism, these two religions should be looked at as having arisen more or less together historically out of the old biblical religion of ancient Israel after the crisis that attended the people of Israel in the first century, that is, the destruction of Jerusalem and its temple. Then, however, he goes a step farther and suggests that the kinship metaphors be abandoned altogether, for they imply ipso facto the kinds of organic entities and absolute separations. Against this implicit understanding, he suggests that, quote, all Judaisms and all Christianities share features that make them a single semantic family, unquote. And this leads him to conclude that rather than parallel but essentially separate histories, I propose a model of shared and crisscrossing lines of history and religious development. This line of thought was further developed by Boyarin in his latest book entitled Borderlines, the Partition of Judeo-Christianity. In that book, published in 2004, Boyarin emphasizes that he is no longer prepared to think in terms of pre-existent different entities, religions if you like, that came to enact gradually or suddenly their difference in a parting of the ways. For in his view, quote, the borders between Christianity and Judaism are as constructed and imposed, as artificial and political as any of the borders on earth. Just as the border between Mexico and the United States is a border that was imposed by strong people on weaker people, so too is the border between Christianity and Judaism. The questions that needs to be asked then are how and why that border was written and who wrote it, who it was in antiquity who desired to make such a difference. How did they accomplish or seek to accomplish that making, and what was it that drove them? Needless to say, by addressing such questions, our focus is profoundly shifted. We no longer concentrate on the relations between Judaism and Christianity, but rather we lay emphasis on the processes that have gradually made them to see themselves as two separate and distinct religions at first place. This formulation of the question, however, implies an equal standing to both sides of the drama. Indeed, in Boyarin's view, the two types of first century Judaism, that is, Rabbinic Judaism on the one hand and Christian Judaism, so to speak, on the other hand, are two equal opportunities which for this or that reason, no matter for the moment what it was, have distanced themselves one from the other. We may think of a diagram of two circles which significantly overlap each other that gradually become two different and detached circles in order to have an idea of the model under which Boyarin's thought on the historical emergence of Christianity operates. So we can look at two circles, two overlapping circles that gradually become two separate circles. This is Boyarin's model. This is at least the model that he has in mind. And this model implies that at an early stage, and this is an extremely important point for me, that at an early stage, the followers of Jesus were not considered as outsiders, and that their separate religious existence was a result of a slow and a long process, not in any event of a clear-cut event. With the latter statement of Boyarin's, I wholeheartedly agree. The underlying historical assumptions on which Boyarin's view rests, however, are a bit difficult to accept, in my opinion. Boyarin, who, like many other scholars for this matter, blindly follows Jacob Neusner, views Jewish society of late Second Temple period as a highly diverse society, and explicitly refuses to accept the notion of mainstream from which Christianity could have been seen as having deviated. In order to imagine a single mother religion that could give birth to a daughter religion, he writes, we have to find some way of reducing the diversity of Jewish religious life in the pre-Christian era to a single object that we can then designate as Judaism. And in contrast to this view, he maintains that, quote, in the Jewish world of the first century, there were many sects competing for the name of the true Israel, and the form of Judaism that was to be the seedbed of what eventually became the church was but one of those sects. The common view that all of the known forms of first century Judaism, except for Christianity, have had some common features that join them all into a single religion, let alone the view that these features were characteristic especially of the Pharisees, are denied by Boyarin altogether. Indeed, the assumption that Palestinian Judaism of the first century was highly diverse functions as the foundation upon which his entire project rests. The problem with this assumption is not merely that it is ideological, although to be sure, it is certainly so. It is simply wrong. Historian Seth Schwartz already noted that, quote, the hypothesis of radical diversity in Jewish society of late Second Temple period is inadequate because the search for differences neglects ancient political, demographic, and social realities. There were necessarily, Schwartz emphasizes, a normative core. There was necessarily a normative core of Judaism before 70 CE. Although, in my opinion, this should be assumed for post-70 generations as well, Schwartz's argument against the view of radical diversity in late Second Temple period is certainly correct. And this is why Rabbinic tradition views the emergence of Christianity as the result of the exclusion of the followers of Jesus from Jewish society of the first and early second century CE by those Jews who were in dominance at the time. And here I arrive at my topic. Thus we read in the Babylonian Talmud Tractate Sanhedrin, in a passage that was unfortunately omitted from the vulgar printed editions due to censorship, but is still found in ancient manuscripts, and I will quote, it does not appear on your handout. Our rabbis taught, ever let the left hand repel and the right hand invite. Ever let the left hand repel and the right hand invite. Neither like Elisha, who repulsed Gehazi with both hands, nor like Rabbi Joshua ben Perachia, who repulsed Jesus the Nazarene with both hands. What is the story about Jesus and Rabbi Joshua? When Yanai the king killed our rabbis, Rabbi Joshua ben Perachia and Jesus fled to Alexandria of Egypt. When there was peace, Shimon ben Shattach sent to him from Jerusalem, saying, from me, Jerusalem, the city of holiness, to you, Alexandria of Egypt, my sister, my husband stays in your midst, and I sit forsaken. Rabbi Joshua returned, and on the way found himself in a certain inn. They showed him great honor. Joshua ben Perachia said, how beautiful is this Ascania, is this inn? Jesus said to him, Rabbi, she has narrow eyes. Rabbi Joshua ben Perachia said, wretch, dust, you employ yourself thus? He sent out 400 trumpets and excommunicated Jesus. Then Jesus came before him many times and said to him, receive me. But Rabbi Joshua would not notice him. One day, Rabbi Joshua was reciting the Shema, and Jesus came before him. And Rabbi Joshua was minded to receive him and made a sign to Jesus. But Jesus thought that he repelled him. He went and hung up a tile and worshipped it. Then Rabbi Joshua ben Perachia said to him, return. But Jesus replied, thus I have received from you that everyone who sins and causes the multitude to sin, they give him not the chance to repent. And we have a tradition that one teacher has said that Jesus the Nazarene practiced magic and led astray and deceived Israel. Like many other stories in the Talmud, this is obviously a non-historical story, as one can easily infer from the very fact that Jesus is presented as the disciple of a sage who is known to have flourished at the beginning of the first century BCE. that is about 100 years before Jesus' birth. We need not bother ourselves, therefore, with the possibility that what we are told here reflects any specific historical event. Nevertheless, the non-historicity of the story does not render it of no value as a source revealing what the rabbis of the Talmud thought about Jesus and, more importantly, about his departure from Judaism. Ernst Bammel was correct, in my opinion, to observe that the story is an expression of rabbinic self-criticism. That is, the Talmudic traditions suggest here that Christianity's break with Judaism was caused by the austerity of the rabbis themselves. The rabbis, according to this obviously non-historical story, are responsible for the departure and separation of Christianity from Judaism because they expelled the early Christians instead of drawing them near. Were we even to doubt this explanation on historical grounds, the story demonstrates, nonetheless, the perspective from which early rabbinic tradition viewed the emergence of its denounced brother or other. That is, the followers of Jesus were excluded from the Jewish community. But how was this achieved? According to early rabbinic tradition, how were the followers of Jesus excommunicated? How were they expelled? A relatively early rabbinic text, presumably from the 2nd or early 3rd century of the Common Era, indicates that the followers of Jesus were labeled as Minim, that is, others, and thus were subject to a set of legal rulings that, practically speaking, cut them off from the rest of the community. I refer to a story found in the Tosefta, Tractate Chulin, chapter 2, which reads as follows, and this is the first passage on your handout. It once happened that Rabbi Elazar ben Dama was bitten by a snake. And one Jacob of Kfar Sama came to heal him in the name of Jesus, son of Pantera. That is, in the name of Jesus. But Rabbi Ishmael did not allow him, he did not allow Rabbi Elazar ben Dama to receive the healing. They said to him, one should read, he said to him, "You are not permitted, Ben Dama." He said to him, that is, Ben Dama replied to Rabbi Ishmael, "I shall bring you proof that he may heal me." But he did not have time to bring the proof before he dropped dead. Said Rabbi Ishmael, "Happy are you, Ben Dama, for you have expired in peace. And you did not break down the hedge erected by the sages. For whoever breaks down the hedge erected by sages, calamity befalls him. As it is said, he who breaks down a hedge is bitten by a snake." This story was dealt with intensively in scholarly literature due to the simple reason that it is the earliest and one of the rarest places in Talmudic literature where Jesus is mentioned explicitly by his name. The narrative itself seems quite simple. Rabbi Elazar ben Dama was bitten by a snake and needed healing. When one Jacob of a village called Kfar Sama proposed to heal him in the name of Yeshu ben Pantera, that is, with Jesus' name, Rabbi Ishmael, who according to other rabbinic traditions was Ben Dama's uncle, did not allow Ben Dama to receive that healing. The latter argued that he can supply a proof, presumably from Scripture, to show that it is permissible, that it is permitted to receive the healing in the name of Jesus, but he did not manage to furnish it before he died. Upon his death, Rabbi Ishmael eulogized him, saying that it is better for him to have died not having transgressed the hedge set up by the sages, for whoever breaks down a hedge is bitten by a snake. Despite of the story's apparent simplicity, various interpretive questions immediately arise. First, what is the relation between the story's ending and its beginning? Or, put differently, what is the function of the apparent literary play on Rabbi Ishmael's use of a verse saying that whoever breaks down a hedge is bitten by a snake, and the story's beginning in which we are told that Rabbi Elazar ben Dama was bitten by a snake? Some scholars have suggested that by means of this literary play, the author hints at the possibility that Rabbi Elazar ben Dama did break down a hedge. That is, that he was, in fact, a close intimate of Christians. He did, whoever breaks down a hedge erected by the sages is bitten by a snake. And he was bitten by a snake. And this implies that he broke the hedge. Some scholars have suggested then that he was a close intimate of followers of Jesus. This might well be historically true, but I think it would be too slim an interpretation to suppose that the story's main thrust was to supply us with a biographical detail about an otherwise virtually unknown rabbi. Underlying this suggestion is an assumed correlation between the snake to which the scriptural verse as read by Rabbi Ishmael refers and the kind of snake by which Elazar ben Dama was bitten. Only such an assumption allows one to suppose that since ben Dama was bitten by a snake, it implies that he actually did break down a hedge. However, not only the explicit statement of Rabbi Ishmael, who eulogized ben Dama for not having done so, rendered this supposition very difficult. It cannot stand simple logical scrutiny. For had the snake in Ecclesiastes 10:8 been understood by Rabbi Ishmael as an actual snake, like the one that bit ben Dama, his eulogy for the latter's departure in peace and thereby avoidance of being bitten again by a snake makes no sense. What is the great advantage of avoiding the danger of death by a snake bite for one who has just died? Necessarily, therefore, Rabbi Ishmael had a metaphorical snake in mind, a bite of which he considered much more severe than the bite of an actual snake. This consideration was raised already by the Palestinian Talmud, who ask, but wasn't he bitten by a snake? And the Talmud answers through a reinterpretation of the quoted verse. Instead, you should understand the verse as saying, lest he shall be bitten by a snake in the future to come. On this reading, Rabbi Ishmael had the future world in mind, a punishment in which was avoided thanks to ben Dama's death prior to his nearly coming breakdown of a hedge. It is possible, though, that the calamity to which Rabbi Ishmael was referring, the snake bite of which he, through the quotation of Ecclesiastes 10:8 was speaking, is the very attachment to Minut, to a follower of Jesus. Ben Dama's error was his very readiness to bring a proof that accepting medical assistance from that Jacob is permissible. His sudden death saved him from breaking this hedge, from bringing the proof that it is permissible. So the real issue was not the receiving of the medical assistance from that follower of Jesus, but the readiness of a rabbi to consider relations with Christians as something legitimate. And hence from being associated with Minut, namely from being bitten by a snake, by a metaphorical snake. Now, whether one follows the former reading or prefers the latter interpretation, the snake against which Rabbi Ishmael warns through his quotation of that verse is not an actual snake like the one that bit ben Dama. And it is precisely against such misunderstanding that the author of the story wishes us to be vigilant. That is, the author intentionally created an opposition between the fact, the actual fact, that ben Dama was bitten by a snake, and Rabbi Ishmael's claim that fortunately ben Dama was not bitten by a snake. And the author did that intentionally in order to draw the reader's attention to contemplate about the nature of true snakes, so as to be able to distinguish between a snake which is merely a this-worldly snake and a snake which is a real one. The author wishes us to be alert not to erroneously confuse essentially different things, even if they appear to be similar. As we shall shortly see, this is indeed an important lesson that emerges from that story. The story begins by telling us that Rabbi Elazar ben Dama was bitten by a snake, and it ends saying that blessed are you, ben Dama, that you were not bitten by a snake. That a verse in Ecclesiastes cannot be applied to you. That is, you did not break down a hedge. You were not bitten by a snake, and this is a contradiction. And this contradiction was created intentionally by the author of the story, so that we will think about this contradiction. And this contradiction teaches us that there are different kinds of snakes. And this is precisely the literary idea of the story. The story wishes to tell us that there are things that appear to be similar, but if we think about them more deeply, we will see that they are different. And as we shall see, this is an important aspect about the relations of Rabbinic Judaism and Rabbinic literature towards the Jesus movement. The other major interpretive question regarding this story is, what was the proof that Rabbi Elazar ben Dama wanted, but ultimately was unable to bring in support of the legitimacy of his desire to be healed by that Jacob, Jesus' followers? This is a true enigma. He wanted to bring a proof. We can easily suppose that that was a serious proof. Rabbi Ishmael was very happy that his nephew did not bring that proof. He did not have the chance to bring forth, to raise this proof. But we, as readers of the story, want very much to know what was that potentially proof that could indicate that relations with Christians were legitimate. But no one really knows. This question, too, was raised, in fact, already by the Talmudic tradition itself. Thus, the Babylonian Talmud asks, Uma hava lei lemeimar, that is, what could have he said? The Talmud's answer is that Ben Dama's supposed proof was from the words, he shall live by them of Leviticus 18:5, because according to the rabbinic tradition itself, surprisingly, according to the stance of Rabbi Ishmael himself, these words furnish the basis for the halachic stance, for the legal stance that permits one to violate the law in order to save one's life. There is a rabbinic general principle that human life is more important than any other thing in the world, except for three major issues: idolatry, bloodshed, and adultery. But according to Rabbi Ishmael, who plays a major role in our story, even in a case of idolatry, one should prefer worshiping an idol rather than losing one's own life. So if one is put under a threat, either you worship that idol or we kill you, according to Rabbi Ishmael, that person must worship the idol and save his or her own life, because the value of human life is the highest possible value in Jewish tradition, certainly for Rabbi Ishmael himself. And this stands obviously in quite a sharp contrast to his stance here, because his nephew Ben Dama could have saved his life had he received the healing by Jesus' name. And the Talmud was aware of that contradiction in Rabbi Ishmael's own legal stance. Now, whether the Talmud's reconstruction of Ben Dama's supposed proof is correct, that is, that the proof was from the words of Leviticus 18:5, he shall v'chai bahem, he shall live by them, whether this reconstruction is correct or not, we will apparently never know. The point, however, is that the very putting forward of the question, that is, so what was the proof, this in itself is misguided. The author of the story killed, so to speak, Ben Dama before he actually brought his proof, because the author didn't want to allow for such a proof to be heard. It is not that the author could have allowed Ben Dama to raise his point, and then perhaps Rabbi Ishmael or someone else could have objected to that proof. But the author didn't want that to happen. The author intentionally did not allow Ben Dama to raise the proof because he didn't want such a proof to be heard at all. And the question is obviously, why? Although apparently it seems to most readers of the story an obvious issue, and therefore, to the best of my knowledge, it is usually not addressed, the question has to be asked, why did Rabbi Ishmael prohibit Ben Dama from receiving the healing by the name of Jesus? The answer to this question has to do with the very reason for the placement of this story by the editor of the Tosefta here at Tractate Chulin. For, after all, one should ask, how is this story related to the subject dealt with by this tractate, which are the rulings regulating the preparation of non-sacral meat for eating? So why does this story appears at all in this tractate? The answer to this question is that our story was placed here because it tallies with the end of the preceding passage, the concluding sentence of which is the prohibition to seek medical assistance from Minim. And this is number 2 on your handout. And the passage reads as follows. You see, it begins with the question whether a meat which is found in the possession of a Gentile is permitted for gain or not. This is certainly relevant to this tractate. But then it goes on to say, meat which is found in the possession of a Gentile is permitted for gain. It is not permitted for consummation. One may not eat such meat because we don't know whether it is a kosher meat or not, but one can use it, for example, to give it to one's dog or to sell it and to make profit of it. But meat which is found in the possession of a min, that is an other, a Jewish other, it is prohibited for gain. It is a severer case. That which goes forth from a pagan temple, Lord, it is deemed to be meat from the sacrifices of corpses. For they, that is, the sages have stated, the act of slaughter of a min is deemed to be for purposes of idolatry. There, the minim, the others, the heretics, however we translate this word, their bread is deemed the bread of a Samaritan, and their wine is deemed wine used for idolatrous purposes, and their produce is deemed wholly untithed. And their books are deemed magical books, and the children are mamzerim, bastards, illegitimate. People are not to sell anything to them, that is to the others, to the minim, to the heretics. People are not to sell anything to them or buy anything from them, and people do not take wives from them or give children in marriage to them, and people do not teach their sons a craft, and they do not seek medical assistance from them, either healing for property or healing for a person. Let's look at these rulings. First, the Tosefta prohibits in a very general manner any economic connections with minim, a term which is most frequently rendered as heretics, but I would rather translate it for the purposes of the present discussion as outsiders. It then deems their wine, bread, and fruit as prohibited for use. The effect of this prohibition goes far beyond making the possibility of common eating impractical. A Jew who wishes to follow rabbinic law would never purchase these products from a person who is considered by the community to be a min, an outsider, even for personal use. As a result, the ability of a min to remain within the confines of the community becomes obviously very limited. The Tosefta also prohibits marriage with the minim, and it further rules that one may not accept from the minim any assistance, even medical one. And they do not seek medical assistance from them, either healing for property or healing for a person. Our story was brought here then because it exemplifies the ruling that one must not receive any medical assistance from the Minim, even if this is necessary for saving one's life. The laws of Minim, however, do not specify their identity, and certainly do not identify them as Christians. Nothing in these laws could have led the reader to suppose that they relate specifically to Christians. What then was the basis for Rabbi Ishmael's application of these laws to Jacob, Jesus' follower? The answer is that this is precisely the point our story wishes to make, that the followers of Jesus should be considered Minim. And this message is reiterated in the next passage in the Tosefta, in the famous story about Rabbi Eliezer's arrest in charge of Minut. Thus we read there, and this is the third passage that you have on your handout. It once happened that Rabbi Eliezer was arrested on account of Minut. They brought him to court for judgment. That Roman hegemon said to him, "Should an elder of your standing get involved in such things?" So Rabbi Eliezer said to him, "The judge is reliable in my view." You see that I printed the judge with a capital J intentionally. That hegemon supposed that he referred only to him, but the truth was that he referred only to his Father in heaven. Hence, judge in capital J. Then the Roman hegemon said to him, "Since you have deemed me reliable for yourself, so thus I have ruled. Is it possible that these gray hairs should err in such matters? Dimisus, law, you are free of liability." And when Rabbi Eliezer left the court, he was distressed to have been arrested on account of matters of Minut. His disciples came to comfort him, but he did not accept their words of comfort. Then Rabbi Akiva came and said to him, "Rabbi, may I say something to you so that you will not be distressed?" And Rabbi Eliezer said to him, "Go ahead." And Rabbi Akiva said to him, "Perhaps some one of the Minim told you something of Minut which pleased you." And Rabbi Eliezer said to him, "By heaven, you remind me. Once I was strolling in the street of Sephoris, I bumped into Jacob of Kefar Sichnin, and he told me a teaching of Minut in the name of Jesus, son of Pantera. And it pleased me. So I was arrested on account of matters of Minut, for I transgressed the teachings of Torah. Keep your way far from her, and do not go near the door of her house. For Rabbi Eliezer himself did teach, one should always flee from what is disruptible and from whatever appears to be disruptible." Since Rabbi Eliezer flourished during the second half of the first and the first quarter of the second century of the Common Era, virtually all interpreters relate this story to the persecutions of the Christians during the time of the Roman Emperor Trajan, about which we know primarily from Pliny the Younger. According to this assumption, Rabbi Eliezer was arrested on charge of being, secretly to be sure, a follower of Jesus, a Christian. The main problem in this reading is that neither Rabbi Eliezer nor we know why was he arrested for that charge. Furthermore, his reply to the judge's question, "The judge is trustworthy in my view," seems awkward. Why did Rabbi Eliezer not simply deny the accusation? Why did not Rabbi Eliezer simply say, "Christianos non sum, Judaios sum"? I am not a Christian, I am a Jew. Several interpreters view this question as a key to the understanding of the story and suggests that the reason for Rabbi Eliezer's abstention from denying the accusation was his very fear that this would result in a demand that he prove his denial by cursing Jesus, as the Romans used normally to do in such cases, an act he wished to avoid. So Rabbi Eliezer had a cunning play. Instead of saying, I deny the accusation, I am not a Christian, he simply said, the judge is trustworthy, in my opinion. Why? According to this suggested interpretation, because he knew that had he said, I am not a Christian, then the judge would rule that, okay, I believe you, but now show you that you are not a Christian. Now the Romans knew that the Jews would not sacrifice to the emperor, but they would easily ask a Jew to, okay, curse Jesus so that we will know that you are not a Christian. But Rabbi Eliezer did not want to get to such a situation because he did not want to curse Jesus because he believed in Jesus. So he was, in a sense, a Christian, a rabbinic Christian. This is a very interesting interpretation of the story. Rabbi Eliezer, according to such an interpretation, had more than some sympathy for Jesus and his followers and their teachings. He actually believed in Jesus. That is, he was a rabbinic Christian. Although theoretically this could be historically true, I have no idea about that. Here too, I think it would be too thin a reading to assume as the story's main idea, to tell us that Rabbi Eliezer was in fact a Christian or so. And the answer to the question why he did not deny the accusation entirely, I believe, should be sought for in another direction. Rabbi Eliezer did not deny the accusation because he truly accepted the judges, that is, God's judgment, as he declared. That is, he was truly convinced that since he was accused for Minut, there must have been something in that accusation. Otherwise, the divine providence would not have turned things in such a way so that he would be arrested for Minut. For that reason, he could not reply to the Roman judge's inquiry by a simple denial, I am not a min, I am not a Christian. Such a reply would have been a lie in Rabbi Eliezer's view, not because he knew that he was a min, but because of the very fact that he was arrested for such a charge indicates that God sees him as a min, and therefore he could not claim he is not. The Rabbi Eliezer really, truly accept God's judgment, and if God turned things in such a manner that he would be arrested in charge of Minut, so Rabbi Eliezer assumed, I am probably somehow a min. And for that reason, he could not say, I am not a min. I deny the accusation. He does not know why he is considered by God a min, but he realizes that he is considered so. And it is precisely this gap which caused him such a deep sorrow. The turning point in the story is Rabbi Eliezer's conversation with his student, Rabbi Akiva, in which the disciple offers his master a solution for the anxiety that troubled him so much. Rabbi Akiva's solution is comprised of three components. Perhaps, 1, some one of the Minim, 2, told you something of Minut, 3, which pleased you. Rabbi Eliezer's reply confirms his disciple's hypothesis, which provides a rationale for the enigmatic fate that befell him. He was arrested for Minut because, in a sense, he is a min. That is, Rabbi Eliezer's intellectual engagement with a min and being pleased by a word of Minut renders him a min. The riddle is thus solved, and Rabbi Eliezer is thereby consoled. One can easily observe that Rabbi Eliezer's reply fully corresponds to Rabbi Akiva's threefold hypothesis. 1, once I was strolling in a street of Sephoris and bumped into Jacob of Kefar Sichnin, so I was someone of the Minim, Jacob, this is someone of the Minim. And 2, he told me a teaching of Minut in the name of Jesus, son of Pantera. And this corresponds to told you something of Minut. And 3, it pleased me. The significant contribution of Rabbi Eliezer's formulation is his identification of one of the Minim and the precise nature of the Minut to which Rabbi Akiva's suggestion related. That is, while the disciple used only a general vague term, one of the Minim, a word of Minut, Rabbi Eliezer furnishes the identity of the Minim, that is, the followers of Jesus. Both this story and the preceding one, then, proclaim that followers of Jesus are Minim. They achieve this goal, however, in a cunning manner. They do not say that Christians should be considered Minim. They portray a situation in which it is presupposed that they are such. By so doing, these stories introduce the notion that Christians are Minim very effectively. So both stories emphasize the need to distance oneself from the Minim in general, and from Christians in particular, and not to be entrapped by the seeming similarity between them and us. The need to distinguish between a legitimate teaching and an illegitimate one is intensified in the parallel version of the story as found in the Babylonian Talmud. For there we are fully informed concerning the teaching which Rabbi Eliezer heard from that Jacob in the name of Jesus. And that word of Torah bears no mark of heresy whatsoever. It reads as follows. He said to him, that is, that Jacob, Jesus' follower, said to him, to Rabbi Eliezer, this is the word of Minut that Rabbi Eliezer heard, which is only hinted at by our story, but not explicated. It is written in your Torah, you shall not bring the fee of a harlot into the house of the Lord your God. Deuteronomy 23:19. Is it permissible to build from it a toilet for a high priest? To use the fee of a harlot in order to build a toilet for a priest? And I did not answer him. Rabbi Eliezer did not have an answer. And he said to me, that Jacob said to me, thus taught me Yeshu HaNotzri, thus taught me Jesus, the Christian. It is written, from the fees of a harlot they were gathered, and they shall return to a fee of a harlot again. Micha 1:7. From the place of dirt they came, so to a place of dirt they shall go. And it pleased me. So a certain follower of Jesus raised a legal question to Rabbi Eliezer, to which he had no answer. And that follower of Jesus offered Rabbi Eliezer an answer, a halachic, a legal answer, in the name of Jesus. He said, thus taught me Jesus. Jesus taught me one word of Torah. And Rabbi Eliezer enjoyed that teaching. He accepted that teaching. He felt that teaching was a good word of Torah. Now, without any doubt, this is Jesus's ruling here is a perfectly rabbinic midrash. In fact, it is so normal that one wonders, what is so wrong about such a teaching? The answer is that it is not necessarily the content of a teaching that renders it a word of minut, a word of heresy, but rather the mere fact that it was suggested by a person who is considered to be a min, that renders it illegitimate. And that specific follower of Jesus, by formulating his question as referring to your Torah, that is not his, thereby placing himself out of the Jewish people, has shown himself to be a min, an other, an outsider. This implies that it is precisely because it is difficult to characterize the essence of minut that one must abstain from any relations with minim. In different ways then, both stories, the story of Rabbi Elazar ben Dama who was bitten by a snake, and wanted to receive healing from a follower of Jesus, and the story of Rabbi Elazar, who heard a word of Torah from a follower of Jesus, both stories carry the same message. Any association with followers of Jesus is contaminating and venomous, and in the bottom line, deadly. Precisely as the verse quoted at the conclusion of the second story claims, "Keep your way far from her and do not go near the door of her house, for many are those she has struck dead." Now, thus far, we have read two stories, and I was offering here a literary analysis of these stories. As a historian, I maintain, however, that much can be historically inferred from the literary analysis of such stories. First, a sensitive reading reveals that they express the notion that distancing oneself from Christians is imperative. And it is imperative precisely because it's difficult to distinguish between them and us, because they appear very similar. And it's difficult to distinguish between a teaching of heresy and a legitimate teaching. And it's precisely because it seems similar that we have to be very alert and to distance ourselves from them. Hence, these stories indicate how difficult it was for the rabbis of the 2nd and 3rd century CE to discern the precise nature of the followers of Jesus, specifically because the difference between them and otherwise kosher rabbinic Jews was extremely difficult to be pointed out. Second, these stories demonstrate the process through which the followers of Jesus were introduced into the already existing category of Minim, and thereby became others. It appears that here is the place where the construction of Christians as non-Jews is made. And this implies that prior to this point, they were not considered so. They were not considered outsiders. The logical connection between this point and the previous one is transparent. Since they were so similar to us, there was needed an act of labeling for the sake of exclusion. They were not different. Had they been obviously different, apparently different, one would not have needed a specific act of labeling in order to create them as different people. A third point is that the force of the ban, so to speak, against the followers of Jesus as revealed by these stories is quite limited. This must be emphasized. In the story of Rabbi Elazar ben Dama, the first one, having social contacts with followers of Jesus is considered a breaking down of a hedge erected by the sages. In the story of Rabbi Elazar, the avoidance of such contacts is justified by the vague principle held specifically by Rabbi Elazar, therefore not necessarily shared by others, that one should always flee from what is disruptible and from whatever appears to be disruptible. Disreputable. In context, this remark says only that Christianity is a thing which is ugly, from a rabbinic perspective, of course. A category which, from a rabbinic perspective, has relatively little normative power. It is not even said here that contact with Christians is prohibited. It says that it is something unfitting. It's not nice. Well, this is a relatively weak normative statement. Taken together, then, these observations allow us to conclude that here is the moment in which a historical change begins to take place. Here the boundary begins to be constructed. And if so, one must conclude, as Anthony Salderini once wrote, that, and I quote, "The separation of Jews and Christians probably did not happen as quickly or neatly as most theories envision. Something there is that loves a high, sharp boundary, but seldom do the boundaries hold, except in the minds of their creators. Now, to what period should this historical change be assigned? Lawrence Schiffman, who correctly notes that even if we were to accept many of the polemical statements in our sources at face value and assume the violations of halacha in the early Christian community to be more extensive, the early Christians would still be considered Jews, argues, however, that this situation changed with the destruction of the temple. That is, right after 70 CE. Similarly, Lee Levine maintains that, and I quote, the destruction of the temple ended any desire or possibility for this group, that is the early Jewish Christian community, to see itself as an integral part of the Jewish people, end quote. According to this widespread view, we are dealing with a change that took place right after 70 CE. Daniel Boyarin, on the other hand, suggested a different approach. Rather than attempting to reconstruct an obscure period out of the centuries later legends that attest to it, I attempt to historicize the texts, he writes, of a very well-attested period, namely the periods in which those legends were produced. And as a result of this methodological stance, Boyarin is inclined to assign the historical change to a much later period. Indeed, the story of Rabbi Eliezer's arrest in Judaism must be viewed as a long process, not as an event. His dating of the emergence of the rabbinic discourse of heresy, however, cannot be accepted in my opinion. First, contrary to a very common error, it must be emphasized that our general hesitations regarding the dating of rabbinic material and the justified refusal to naively assign them to the days of the dramatis personae themselves, as traditional readers of these stories tend to do not entail their assignment to the days of the editors any more credence. For the story could have been composed in any moment in the interval between the time of Rabbi Eliezer and that of the editor of the Tosefta. Just as one would require concrete and reliable evidence to a dating in the time of the historical Rabbi Eliezer itself, so too it would be required for a dating to the days of the editor. And just as we don't have the former, so too we do not have the latter. To see therefore these stories as, quote, a representation of the complexities of the relationship between Rabbinic Judaism and Christianity in the periods in which those legends were produced is one thing with which I wholeheartedly agree. But to argue that that period was specifically the early 4th century is to misrepresent the evidence. Furthermore, as Sol Lieberman noted long ago, and I quote, in the beginning of the 4th century, Christianity was no longer the creed of Jewish heretics, for it had long become the faith of the Gentiles. It is therefore difficult to accept Boyarin's dating of these stories, for as we have seen, a central notion that they both express is the need for one to distance oneself from followers of Jesus precisely because the difference between Judaism and Christianity were not clear. Needless to say, such a notion can hardly be imagined as the stance of rabbinic Jews in the 4th century. Indeed, sayings pertaining to Minim and Minut appear throughout early rabbinic literature, some of which are even attributed to named rabbis who flourished during the first third of the 2nd century CE, and others to sages who lived during the second half of that century. And I have a long list of rabbis, Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Ishmael and Rabbi Yossi the Galilean, Shimon ben Azai, Rabbi Nathan, Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar and others. And to this list one may add, if a tradition in the fathers according to Rabbi Nathan is to be believed, another mid-2nd century rabbi, Rabbi Joshua ben Korcha, who referred to Minut in one of his sayings. The variety of these sources, all are very early sources, renders a sweeping suspicion in the reliability of the attribution in all these cases extremely feeble. Were we even to embrace a hypercritical stance and question the accuracy of this or that specific attribution in this long list, still it would be very difficult to disregard the overall fact that all these sayings appear in the names of 2nd century rabbis. And this obviously undermines the possibility that we are dealing with a late 3rd, let alone 4th century discourse. The truth of the matter is that already by the early 2nd century, Christianity was recognized by Roman officials as a distinct religion, distinguished from Judaism, as one can infer both from Pliny the Younger and from Tacitus. It is difficult to imagine that an imperial discourse that has distinguished Christians from Jews has had no effect on Jews and Christians themselves. To be sure, this does not necessarily imply that all Christians were considered by all Jews in the same manner. However, the Jews could not have avoided wondering about an identity question which was produced by Roman discourse that did recognize such a difference. The chronological assignment of the rabbinic discourse of heresy to the 2nd century, which is implied by the attribution of many of the Tanaitic sayings pertaining to Minim and Minut to early 2nd century rabbis, goes therefore hand in hand with a contemporary, broader discourse of the empire. And this is probably not a mere coincidence. For discourse of boundaries, deviance, and exclusion is closely related to and evolves in time of identity crisis. And the period following the destruction of the Second Temple was indeed marked by such a crisis. A major aspect of this crisis was the production of a new discourse of heresy. This discourse was based on the construction of heresy as social separatism, and it resulted in the labeling expulsion of Minim from Jewish society. The reason for this reaction is that separatists and sectarians pose the most severe challenge to a group's identity. They seem to be exiting from the community, but at the same time they assert that their way is the true representation of that community's values, thereby challenging the group's answers both to the question who we are and to the question who we are. It is therefore necessary for the community to entirely exclude such separatists and sectarians and create as sharp as possible a boundary between them and us, so as not to allow any existence on the borderline. For the categorical ousting of separatists and their production as an absolute other eliminate the threat they pose to the group's identity through their claim to have an alternative to that identity. And it is precisely because the differences between them and us are not always transparent that the dividing line must be drawn in the most unequivocal manner. The ultimate way of achieving this goal is through social exclusion. Understanding this enables us to comprehend the social process whereby groups that seclude themselves from the rest of society are at the same time excluded by that society, a very common phenomenon. The response to the wicked child in the famous Baraita of the four sons that is found in the Passover Agada is illuminating in this context. We say that since he excluded himself from the community, you too exclude him for the community. And this formulation demonstrates the deep reciprocal relations existing between the separatists' withdrawal from the community and his or her ousting by the rest of the society. Let me conclude. In his analysis of the Quaker crisis in Massachusetts Bay during mid-17th century, sociologist Kai Erikson, then at Yale, noted that, and I quote, Literature from the period fairly crackles with angry denunciations of the Quakers, but for all the heat generated by this verbal attack, it seems that the authorities neither knew very much nor cared what theories lay behind the Quaker crusade. End quote. This obviously raises the question, what were then the reasons behind these denunciations? Erickson attempts to answer this question through a description of a case where one of the Quaker suspects was told that he was really accused of blasphemy, whereupon he made the sensible suggestion that the magistrates should visit a Quaker meeting so that they might hear and give an account of what was done and spoken, and not conclude about a thing they knew not. To this he was answered, and I quote, "If ye meet together and say anything, we might conclude ye speak blasphemy." This reply, Erickson remarks, had stated the real point. It did not matter very much whether a Quaker was actually overheard muttering some spiritual indignity or other. For in the very process of remaining aloof from the ideological consensus of the community, he had proved himself to be a blasphemous creature. This is precisely the perspective from which early rabbinic sources view the nascent Jesus movement. Heresy for the rabbis of 2nd century of the Common Era in Palestine was first and foremost an issue of separatism. And separatism for the rabbis was perceived as the gravest religious sin. Precisely as the famous Baraita of the 4 sons that I quoted before says of the wicked child, since he excluded himself from the community, he thereby rejected the essence, that is, he rejected God. So because he excluded himself from the community, we see that as a rejection of the divine. By introducing the followers of Jesus into the already existent category of Minim, that is, separatists, the rabbis have constructed them as separatists and schismatics, and thereby contributed to the creation of Christianity as a separate religion. It was not the Christians' belief in Jesus as such that made them to be others. Neither was it their belief in Jesus' messiahship, as Rabbi Akiva, for example, also believed in one person to be the Messiah, and he turned to be wrong. Rabbi Akiva believed that Simon, the son of Koziba, was the Messiah, and he turned to be wrong. So what was the great difference between Rabbi Akiva, who thought that one Simon was the Messiah, but he was wrong, and another person, say Paul of Tarsus, who believed that one Jesus, son of Mary, is the Messiah, and from a rabbinic perspective, turned to be wrong? What is the big difference? It was not so, obviously. It was the mutual social process of seclusion and exclusion that produced the early Jewish followers of Jesus as Christians. Thank you very much.